Sweater weather! It's sweater weather! Do you guys remember that skit from SNL? So good, such a classic. And in fact, it's a classic because it's one that I embrace. I love my sweater weather, and what I love even more about sweater weather is that it is time for harvest. The fall is bringing around all of its fabulous bounty with all of those cozy roasted vegetables and soups and stews, and I'm pretty excited about it. So today I'm going to show you how to make the most of your sweater weather fall bounty with some really terrific wine pairings. Hi wine lovers, I'm Erin, the founder and chief sommelier here at the Wine Sisters. Welcome to our YouTube channel. This is the place where every week we show you how to eat, drink, and entertain like a pro. Today we're talking about fall vegetables and wine pairings. So many of you will write into the Wine Sisters and ask us about food and wine pairings in general, but especially when it comes around to all of the root veggies of the season. For some reason, despite how delicious they are, us sommeliers have given them a bit of a bad rap, talking about how fearful they are to pair with wine. And I guess that could technically be true. All of your cruciferous and green vegetables, things like kale and cauliflower and turnips and onions and garlic and Brussels sprouts, yeah, sure. They can be a bit challenging to pair with wine when you have them on their own, but how often are you having them on your own, right? I feel like a bit of a broken record because we do talk about this all the time, but it's worth repeating. You want to pair your wine with the strongest element of the dish, the sauces, the spices, the other flavorings. Rarely are you having that thing all on its own. There's going to be other elements added to it. So let's get through some really terrific wine pairings that will help you make the most of your fall eating. Shall we start with the much maligned Brussels sprout? These are one of my favorites. I absolutely love Brussels sprouts, and I think so many of you do as well because they're popping up on menus and have been for probably the last decade because they are a darling. Sure, back in your grandmother's day when they were boiled to a limp gray mush, no, they weren't particularly great. But now when we have them, they're roasted and they're charred and they have all kinds of seasonings with them. They're often paired with salty pancetta and bacon, and it makes it absolutely exquisite. You're not really sitting around just munching on the Brussels sprout itself, right? I mean, I guess if you are, that's a story for another day and maybe a conversation with your therapist. But when we have these Brussels sprouts and the very popular way of cooking them, roasting them in a high heat oven so they get that really nice blackened char, pairing them with some fatty, salty bacon or pancetta, and giving them all of that beautiful, rich crispness, you are now in wine heaven. In fact, people, what you want to consider doing is you could even go to your red. So for a nice roasted Brussels sprout, I'm going with a Cabernet Franc. I've got one here from my home province. This is in Niagara. It's the Mason Vineyard Cabernet Franc, and I love Cab Francs. I love all my children, but one of my very favorites is the Cab Franc variety, whether it's coming from Bordeaux or Loire or right here in Ontario. These wines are rich with their red fruit and their black fruit, but there's a really great backbone of some herbal spice. It can come through by the way of rosemary or a little tiny wink of bell pepper, but they've got this herbaceousness that picks up really nicely with the natural greenness of a Brussels sprout. But when we're talking about the rich char that comes from roasting Brussels sprouts, char inherently has a pleasing bitterness to it. So that red fruit from the Cabernet Franc really sets it off nicely. Not to mention that salty goodness of the bacon or the pancetta if you're pairing with that. Now let's move on to what is quite possibly the vegetable mascot of fall, and that's your butternut squash. And for very good reason. It's sweet and it's creamy and it's delicious. You can roast it, you can throw it into a risotto. There's so many things that you can do with it, but probably the most popular thing you're gonna be seeing on Pinterest and Instagram and all over your socials is the variations of a butternut squash soup. In fact, we did one just a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Thanksgiving Day appetizers, where we gave you the recipe for our butternut squash and blue cheese soup. All of you are loving it. It took off like wildfire. If you haven't yet got that recipe, just go to this video right here and get it because it is chef's kiss. You will absolutely love it, and it's dead easy to make. But back to the task at hand. When we're looking at a nice butternut squash soup, or even if it's a butternut squash that's been roasted and thrown into a creamy risotto or added to a mix of other vegetables, what you've got here is you've got a slightly sweet, very creamy and rich vegetable. So I'm going with the classic. I'm going with the cold weather, comforting Chardonnay. This is also from my home province of Ontario, so shout out to the home team. This is from the Niagara region, so it's a cool climate Chardonnay. Leaning Post is the winery, and this has lots of creamy texture. It's a mid-weight to full palate, and that sort of buttery creaminess of the wine is going to mirror that creaminess of a butternut squash soup. Absolutely delicious. And when you start to get into all of those roasted, earthy kind of notes that come with the butternut squash soup, along with, black pepper, maybe you've got a little bit of cumin in there. There's also some thyme, some bay leaf. You've got some nice earthy elements that will play really nicely off your Chardonnay as well. If you have a tendency to skew more to the sweeter side for your butternut squash soup, maybe you're putting in more cinnamons and nutmegs and you're making it a little bit sweeter with brown sugar, you might want to consider a Riesling to play off that sweetness. But if we're going more that savory route, pick up on that creaminess and go with a nice cool climate Chardonnay. I think you're going to be really impressed, and it's going to be quite a nice element to your dinner. Okay, it might surprise you to know as well that even though when we think about salads, we're thinking about summertime, but right now in fall, this is when all the lettuces come out. So we're talking about all of the beautiful peppery arugulas. We're talking about the bitter chicories like radicchios. We're talking about, of course, the heartier kales. And these are gonna go into whatever kind of salad you want. But again, just to repeat the theme, we're not just sitting around eating arugula on its own. We're probably putting it into a salad where there's going to be some kind of vinaigrette. So when we're talking about that vinaigrette that has that nice acidic bite, pick up on that with a Sauvignon Blanc. I've got one here. It's a little bit of an outlier. This one is from the Saint Brie appellation of Burgundy. Curiously, this is an appellation that grows Sauvignon Blanc and Sauvignon Gris. It's really the only one in Burgundy that does so. Most of Burgundy grows Chardonnay, as we probably all know, as for its white grape. But this is a nice Sauvignon Blanc that has an element of greenness. So once again, picking up on the herbal edge of your lettuces, but it also has a little minerality, and that bright mouth-watering acid that you get when you sip on a Sauvignon Blanc will really play nicely against that vinaigrette. So use that when you're pairing that with all of your fall lettuces and your fall greens. It's gonna be really great. And then finally, we've also got the beet. Right? Who doesn't love a good roasted beet? I'd try juggling them, but I'd make a fool of myself, so I'm not going to. Beets obviously have a little bit of sweetness balanced by that earthy kind of flavor. And so a classic pairing, we're gonna go with a lighter red. Pinot Noir would be a great choice, but also Gamete. So I've got one of my favorite Gametes coming out of Beaujolais. This is from the crew of Fleury. So again, we've got some black pepper spice, we've got loads of red fruit, we've got some of those foresty notes, and that echoes and makes a classic pairing for your beets. So regardless of how you're having them, boiled and put in salads, roasted and added as a side dish to your roast chickens and steaks, or maybe you're just simply chopping them up fine, putting them in a salad, whatever you're doing, Gamete and beets are really terrific and they really mirror each other's flavors, so go with that. And last, but certainly not least, it's also mushroom season. If you follow anybody in Italy, you know that the truffle hunt is on, but there's loads of different mushrooms that are coming out in the fall. So whether it's going to be your wild morel, or whether it's going to be your simple cremini, or whether you've got your portobello, or even check this out. I picked this up at the farmer's market the other day. This is called lion's mane. Isn't that great? Doesn't that look beautiful? It's really healthy for you too, but it's super delicious, and you eat it just chopped up like you would a steak. A little bit of garlic, a little bit of salt and pepper, sauteed in some beautiful olive oil. Absolutely exquisite. But you could also shred it and add it to like crab cakes, or you could then even add it to other things like stews, risottos. These are great. But mushrooms are inherently meaty. That's why so many of us, when we're faced with vegetarian and vegan options, will recommend going with a mushroom, let's say a mushroom bourguignon as opposed to a beef bourguignon. Or let's say we add mushrooms to a filling of a shepherd's pie as opposed to lamb. Or let's say instead of adding a steak, we will do exactly what I just said with this lion's mane, chop it up, sear it on both sides, and serve it almost like a steak itself. They have a really inherently meaty character. So that means it's one of the vegetables that goes really, really nicely with a red wine. Now, I just mentioned Italy as well. Of course, when we're talking about the truffles, the place that comes to everybody's mind is typically Piemonte, although of course you would have it in Umbria and other places as well. But Piemonte, the main red grapes coming out of Piemonte, is the fierce and delectable Nebbiolo, typically from the famous regions of Barolo and Barbaresco. But you also can have a daily sipper called Barbera. And one of my favorite producers out of Piemonte is Michele Chiarello. This is La Corte, which is made from Barbera. The Barbera grape, it's fresh and it's juicy. It's got lots of deep black fruit flavors, a little bit of this spice, and it's going to offset your mushrooms, especially when they're stewed or braised, so beautifully. It's another classic pairing and makes for a really heartwarming, cozy meal on a cool fall evening. So wine lovers, by no means is this an exhaustive list. The beauty of fall is that there is plenty of vegetables to go around to make for really interesting dinners every night for the rest of the fall season. And that's what makes eating and drinking so much fun. If you want more tips, just head over to thewinesisters.com, go to our blog. We've got loads of ideas for different ways to pair food and wine, but don't be afraid to play around. What you want to look for, like we talked about, is the strongest elements on the dish. What are the flavorings you're putting towards these vegetables? What are the sauces? What are the spices? How are you preparing them? And that'll give you a little bit of an indication as to where you should go with your wine. And really, as you can see here, we've got everything from lighter to fuller bodied in both reds and whites. So really the world is your oyster, or maybe your cabbage. I don't know. Now, if you have a question about some of your fall favorite foods and what wines might go best with them, just leave it in the comments below. I will get back to you as soon as I see it. And if you found value in this video, please share it with your wine-loving and foodie friends. We want to make sure this video and this channel gets out to as many eyes as possible. So with that in mind, if you could just leave us a like, and maybe even hit subscribe to that channel, that will really go a long way to bringing us up so that more people can see what we're all about. And really, it's all about having a great conversation on how to eat, drink, and entertain like a pro. So until next week, wine lovers, stay well, drink better, and happy fall cooking.